Distinguished guests, excellencies, and friends, welcome to SHIN-DC's annual Congressional Commemoration 2021. We have over 1,000 participants joining us today for what promises to be a meaningful program with very distinguished speakers. We express our gratitude to our annual congressional sponsor, Representative Jamie Raskin, also to the Embassy of Israel, and to all of our co-sponsors who are listed on the program. We gather today to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to honor the survivors. The events that occurred 76 to 90 years ago resulted in a destruction of European Jewish life, including Sephardic, Romaniot, and Ashkenazi communities. And more broadly, they showed the extent of challenges to humanity. We are forever grateful to those who were at the forefront of fighting the evil for the benefit of humanity back then, the righteous, and all those who helped save Jews, including the refugees of the Holocaust. Today, there are other unique challenges to humanity, notably the pandemic. In this context, I would like to introduce our special guest speaker, Dr. Albert Burla. As Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Pfizer, Dr. Burla leads the company to deliver breakthroughs that change patients' lives through scientific and commercial innovation. As we all know, Pfizer has been a major force for transforming human health by developing, along with BioNTech, the world's first widely authorized COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Bourla is on the executive committee of the Partnership for New York City, a vice president of the IFPMA, a trustee of the U.S. Council for International Business, and a director on multiple boards, including Pfizer, the Pfizer Foundation, Pharma, and Catalyst. Dr. Burla is a doctor of veterinary medicine with a PhD from the Veterinary School of Aristotle University in his hometown of Thessaloniki, Greece. And it's his roots in Thessaloniki's Sephardic Jewish community that have led him to speak to us today to honor the blessed memory of his parents, Mois and Sara Bourla, residents of Thessaloniki who were among the few there to survive the Holocaust. Dr. Burla, thank you for joining us. It is very inspiring that the children of Shoah survivors are now on the front line of fighting today's plague. Your presence here is an honor to us. We look forward to hearing your remarks on this solemn occasion. The floor is yours, Dr. Burla.
Thank you, Ephraim, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great honor for me to be asked to share my family story in connection with this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Remembrance is a word perhaps more than any other that inspired me to share my parents' story. That's because I recognize how fortunate I am that my parents shared their stories with me and the rest of our family. Many Holocaust survivors never spoke to their children of the horrors they endured because it was too painful. But we talked about it a great deal in my family. Growing up in Thessaloniki, in Greece, we would get together with our cousins on the weekends, and my parents, my aunts, and my uncles will often share their stories. They did this because they wanted us to remember all the lives that were lost, to remember what can happen when the virus of evil is allowed to spread unchecked. But most important, to remember the value of a human life. You see, when my parents spoke of the Holocaust, they never spoke of anger or revenge. They didn't teach us to hate those who did this to our family and to our friends. Instead, they spoke of how lucky they were to be alive and how we all needed to build on that feeling, to celebrate life and move forward. Hatred would only stand in the way. So in that spirit, I'm here to share the story of Mois and Sara Bourla, my beloved parents. Our ancestors had fled Spain in the late 15th century after King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, which mandated that all Spanish Jews either convert to Catholicism or be expelled from the country. They eventually settled in the Ottoman Thessaloniki, which later became part of Greece, following its liberation in 1912. Before Hitler began his march through Europe, there was a thriving Sephardic Jewish community in Thessaloniki. So much so that it was known as La Madre de Israel, or the Mother of Israel. Within a week of the occupation, however, the Nazis had arrested the Jewish leadership, evicted hundreds of Jewish families, and confiscated their apartments. And it took them less than 3 years to accomplish their goal of exterminating the community. When the Germans invaded Greece, there were approximately 50,000 Jews living in the city. By the end of the war, only 2,000 had survived. Lucky for me, both of my parents were among the 2,000. My father's family, like so many others, had been forced from their home and taken to a crowded house within one of the Jewish ghettos. It was a house they had to share with several other Jewish families. They could circulate in and out of the ghetto as long as they were wearing the yellow star. But one day, in March of 1943, the ghetto was surrounded by occupational forces and the exit was blocked. My father, Mois, and his brother, Into, were outside when this happened. When they approached back, they met their father, who was also outside. He told them what was happening and asked them to leave and hide, because he had to go in, because his wife and his 2 other children were home. So later that day, my grandfather, Albert Burla, his wife Rachel, his daughter Graciela, and his younger son David were taken to a camp outside the train station. And from then, they left for Auschwitz-Birkenau. Mois, my father, and his brother Into never saw them again. The same night, my father and uncle escaped to Athens when they were able to obtain fake IDs with Christian names. They got the IDs from the head of police at that time, who was helping Jews escape the persecution of the Nazis. They lived in Athens until the end of the war, all the while having to pretend that they were not Jews, that were not Mois and Into, but rather Manolis and Vasilis. When the German occupation ended, they went back to Thessaloniki and found that all their property and belongings had been stolen or sold. With nothing to their name, they started from scratch, becoming partners in a successful liquor business that they ran together until they both retired. My mom's story also was one of having to hide in her own land, of narrowly escaping the horrors of Auschwitz, and of family bonds that sustained her spirit and quite literally saved her life. Like my father's family, my mom's family was relocated to a house within the ghetto. My mother was the youngest girl of 7 children. Her older sister had converted to Christianity to marry a Christian man she fell in love with. That happened before the war. And she and her husband were living in another city where no one knew that she had previously been a Jew. At that time, mixed weddings were not accepted by society. And my grandfather wouldn't talk to his eldest daughter because of this and after she did that. By when it became clear that the family was going to head to Poland, when the Germans had promised a new life in a Jewish settlement, my grandfather asked his eldest daughter to come and see him. In this last meeting they ever had, he asked her to take her younger sister, my mom, Sarah, with her. He thought that there my mom would be safe because no one knew that she or her sister were of Jewish heritage. The rest of the family, they went by train straight to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Toward the end of the war, my mom's brother-in-law was transferred back to Thessaloniki. People knew my mom there, so she had to hide in the house 24 hours a day out of fear of being recognized and turned over to the Germans. But she was still a teenager, and every so often she would venture outside. And unfortunately, during one of those walks, she was spotted and arrested. She was sent to a local prison. It was not good news. It was well known that every day around noon, many of the prisoners would be loaded on a truck to be transferred to another location where the next dawn they would be executed. Knowing this, her brother-in-law, my dearest Christian uncle Kostas Dimadis, approached Max Merton, a known war criminal who was in charge of the Nazi occupation forces in the city. He paid Merton a ransom in exchange for his promise that my mom would be spared, would not be executed. But her sister, my aunt, didn't trust the Germans and their word. So she would go to the prison every day at noon to watch as they loaded the truck that would transfer the prisoners to the execution site, hoping that my mother would not be among them. And one day she saw what she had been afraid of, my mom being put on the truck. She ran home and told her husband, who immediately called Merton. He reminded him of their agreement and tried to shame him for not keeping his word. Merton said he would look into it and then abruptly hang up the phone. That night was the longest in my aunt and uncle's life because they knew the next morning my mom would likely be executed. The next day, on the other side of our town, my mom was lined up against a wall with other prisoners, my teenage mom. And moments before she would have been executed, a German soldier on a BMW motorcycle arrived and handed some papers to the men in charge of the firing squad. They removed from the line my mom and another woman. As they rode away, my mom could hear the machine gun fire slaughtering those that were left behind. It's a sound that stayed with her for the rest of her life. 2 or 3 days later, she was released from prison. And just a few weeks after that, the Germans left Greece. Fast forward 8 years, and my parents were introduced by their families in a typical, for the time, matchmaking. They liked each other and agreed to marry. They had 2 children, me and my sister Sally. My father had 2 dreams for me. He wanted me to become a scientist, and he was hoping that I would marry a nice Jewish girl. I'm happy to say that he lived long enough to see both dreams come true. Unfortunately, he died before our children were born. But my mom did live long enough to see them, which was the greatest of blessings. So that is the story of Mois and Sara Bourla. It's a story that had a great impact on my life and my view of the world. And it is a story that, for the first time today, I share publicly. However, when I received the invitation to speak at this event, at this moment of time, when racism and hatred are tearing at the fabric of our great nation, I felt it was the right time to share the story of 2 simple people who loved each other, loved the others, they were loved by the others, and they loved their family and friends. 2 people who shut down hatred and build a life filled with love and joy. 2 people whose names are known by very few, but whose story has now been shared with the members of the United States Congress, the world's greatest and most just legislative body. And that makes their son very, very proud. That brings me back to remembrance. As time marches on and today's events rings in our rearview mirrors, I wouldn't expect you to remember my parents' names, but I implore you to remember their story. Because remembering gives each of us the conviction, the courage, and the compassion to take the necessary actions to ensure their story is never repeated. Thank you again for the invitation to speak today, and thank you for remembering. Stay safe and stay well.
Dr. Bourla, thank you for telling your family story and for your inspiring words. We receive your words as also being in honor of all those others who made it through and of those who perished during those horrible years. We are very proud of your contribution to the world today, and the fact that it is the son of Holocaust survivors who is making this contribution is very meaningful to all of us who are gathered here today. We will now receive remarks from the event's congressional sponsor, Representative Jamie Raskin.
Hello, my dear friends. It's Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's 8th Congressional District. Welcome, everyone, to this year's Congressional Holocaust Commemoration with Sephardic Heritage International. It's such an honor to be the congressional sponsor for this observance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm sorry we can't gather together in person this year, but I'm very grateful that we're able to do it virtually, and I thank you all for coming and participating. As we mark the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we remember the millions of victims of the Holocaust and reaffirm our commitment to protect democracy and human rights and the dignity of every individual in the face of rising racism, authoritarianism, and fascism. The theme for this year's commemoration is Refugees of the Holocaust, looking at experiences of diverse Jewish refugees in Portugal, the Balkans, North Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia, as well as the factors affecting their disparate searches for refuge. With this theme in mind, we must defend Jewish communities across the world and at home who continue to face the forces of anti-Semitism, racism, fascism, and violence. Remembering this history is solemn, but it is a profound duty that all of us have so that we can honor our vow never again to allow such atrocities to occur to the Jewish people or to anyone else. Thank you for inviting me to join you again this year, and I look forward to when we can observe this day in person, and thank you all for your continuing devotion to protecting human rights.
Many thanks to Congressman Raskin. We also extend heartfelt condolences to him and his family on the terribly sad news of the loss of his beloved son, Tommy Raskin. May his memory be for a blessing. We will now receive remarks from Representative Gregory Meeks, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
Good afternoon. I'm Congressman Gregory Meeks, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm honored to speak to you today on this most solemn occasion. First, let me thank Franz Ofrahim Katzer for the kind invitation, and I want to thank you all for the important work you do to raise awareness of the Sephardic heritage. On this day, the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Nazi concentration camps and the end of the Holocaust, we solemnly observe and remember. We pause to remember and honor the victims of the Holocaust, a truly unparalleled crime against humanity. We collectively mourn the loss of so many. We all have a moral obligation to remember that the Holocaust was a systematic attempt to eliminate the Jewish people based on a concerted campaign of hate and genocide. Joining you here today with this year's theme of Refugees of the Holocaust, I'm reminded of our past as a nation, of our founding as a nation of immigrants and refugees, but also of our failings. I'm reminded of the SS St. Louis, the ship of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi advances in Europe that was cruelly turned away from American shores in 1939. Tragically, the ship was eventually forced to return to Europe, and many of its passengers were killed at the hands of Nazis. And at other times, our country has served as a beacon of hope for those fleeing persecution, such as those escaping the repressive Soviet state and the destruction of the Vietnam War and the bitter conflict of the Balkans. Now again, we have the opportunity and moral obligation to reverse anti-refugee policies and again seek to open our doors to those seeking refuge from persecution and strife. Unfortunately, and indeed shamefully, xenophobia and anti-Semitism are both very well alive today. We've seen it in recent years. We've seen a rise in hate crimes, violent acts of hatred toward Jewish communities in the United States and Europe, fueled by demagoguery and vitriol. We've seen this hate speech fuel violent acts of hate against our communities and our neighbors, Black, Jewish, and immigrant. We've seen it from Charlottesville to Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue, to anti-Semitic attacks in Brooklyn last spring, to earlier this month in our own capital, where racist and anti-Semitic slogans could be heard like battle cries. Such acts of hate cannot be ignored, cannot be tolerated, and must be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And I am concerned, but yet I remain hopeful. Just last week, President Biden declared on those same steps nearly overrun by violent insurrectionists that we can deliver justice, and we can once again make America the leading force for good in the world. Already, he has reversed the Muslim ban, pledged to increase refugee admissions, and committed to investigating and prosecuting hate crimes and domestic extremists. As chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I commit to ensuring our nation is once again a beacon of light in the world, and recommit to combating the vicious scourge of anti-Semitism. We are a nation of immigrants, and America is stronger when we welcome refugees and embrace all communities and people who make our nation strong. So today, as we remember and honor the millions who lost their lives in the Holocaust and pay tribute to those who survived, we pledge never to forget, but also never to end the fight against anti-Semitism and xenophobia. Thank you.
Many thanks to Chairman Meeks for his remarks. We now turn to Her Excellency Alexandra Papadopoulou, Ambassador of Greece to the United States, whom we are honored to count as a friend of SHIN-DC, actively participating in multiple programs. The Greek-Jewish relationship is very valuable to us, and we appreciate the important role of Greek Jews as that relationship grows further over time. Ambassador Papadopoulou, over to you.
Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be invited to speak today in this event. Today is a day of sober commemoration as we honor the millions of Jews that were murdered or suffered horrific acts during one of the darkest times in our history, leaving an indelible stain on humanity. This is also a day when we hold ourselves accountable and renew our commitment to never forget. This is the day when we should all commit that we will take every action that these evil forces will not rear their ugly heads ever again, that we will react, we will not turn our heads away at the first signs of the monster, and that we will never, never stay silent again. Greece has been home to Europe's oldest Jewish communities, who have lived in Greece for over 2,000 years. Our city of Thessaloniki was the Jewish diaspora's most important city for over 5 centuries. It is also a city that bore the brunt of the Holocaust very, very hard. So for my country, it is an obligation to the memory of those who were perished during the Nazi occupation, and also to the memory of all those who took risks to protect the lives of their fellow Jewish human beings, to take a strong stance against anti-Semitism, adopting the working definition of anti-Semitism as formed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whose chairmanship is going to be taken over by Greece next month. Also for a country, it's an obligation to adopt the working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, as we did among the first countries who did so, and take concrete actions so that hard measures are in place in order to punish those who deny the Holocaust and also educate the population and the younger generation about the horrors of what happened. And despite the fact that the majority of our Jewish compatriots in Greece lost their lives to the evil instincts of Nazism, the Greek Jewish community retains its dynamic presence, thriving and greatly contributing to Greece and to the world, an integral part of Greek society, as so aptly exemplified by today's keynote speaker, Mr. Albert Burla. Thank you so very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Papadopoulou, for your most fitting remarks. The Holocaust was a global tragedy. Different countries were affected, and the righteous people in different countries distinguished themselves in various ways. In Albania, the number of Jews was greater after World War II than before. We are now honored to have some remarks from Her Excellency Florida Faber, Ambassador of Albania to the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aferim. Dear colleague ambassadors, dear Mrs. Daniels, Dr. Burla, dear organizers, so many participants, I am privileged and honored to be here today and be part of this annual Congressional Holocaust Memorial. During the last several years now, I have been part of many events where proudly representing Albanian people, the very common Albanians who saved lives of every single Jew who lived in Albania during the World War II. Albanians have played a crucial role during difficult times for Jewish people because every member of the Jewish community residing within Albanian borders survived during the Holocaust. The stories of Jews during the World War II were silent for a few decades. The story of Albanians who saved Jews was one of them, unknown to the world and unknown to many of us as Albanians. In many rooms I've entered and auditoriums I have addressed as I was Ambassador of Albania here in the United States, I was the first to tell the audience that there was not a single known case of Jews being turned over to Nazi authorities in Albania during the Nazi occupation. I was the first to voice that Albania was the only country in the world that had 10 times more Jews after the war than before the World War II started. It is for this reason that today I am particularly thankful to the organizers for putting together events like this, where we gather to commemorate the particular moment in history and speak with the hope that values that we have learned from the past will triumph. We teach the new generation respect for human rights, all inclusiveness, and respect for other ethnic and religious groups. All this should lie in the foundation of our societies as to ensure that future generations do not make the same mistakes again. In the world where we live today, we should not stand and witness intolerance. During the pandemic, we have witnessed extremism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of racism. We should not tolerate and should take necessary steps to prevent any ism to flourish in the future. We see actions of anti-Semitism across the world, and as the Prime Minister of Albania emphasized in one of his speeches, speaking to a Balkan summit of anti-Semitism, I quote, "We need to continue and fight any form of anti-Semitism which is a threat to our civilization upon which our common future is being built." Albania remains a strong advocate for combating anti-Semitism and has taken actions and real commitments. In a very difficult year like 2020, the Albanian parliament adopted ERA definition, which was a strong step toward combating anti-Semitism. Adopting the ERA definition is a powerful statement of tolerance and respect, that there is no place for bigotry and racism. We hope that this important step which Albania has embarked on will be followed by other countries. And we felt that as a start, a strong effort must be made to build a united front among the Balkans to act collectively against any form of anti-Semitism. In this regard, in October last year, the Albanian parliament organized the first ever Balkans forums against anti-Semitism with a high level of participation, including former Secretary of State. It was a great momentum and a historic gathering on this issue, and we are living in unprecedented times. The stories of the past should help us build for a better future. The stories should be told, and events like this of today should be often held. I conclude by thanking the organizers for putting this wonderful event together. Thank you for bringing the voice of Albania and making it a very active part of it. And I wish you good luck for the rest of the program.
Thank you, Ambassador Faber, for your inspiring words. Portugal, part of Sepharad, the Hebrew name of Iberia, is home to a historical Jewish community. Even after the expulsion, Portuguese Jews have continued feeling much connection and affinity to Portugal. And recently, Portugal offered nationality to the descendants of Portuguese Jews, a very meaningful gesture of historic reconciliation that is re-energizing Jewish life there. During World War II, neutral Portugal was a key port where Jews found refuge and through which they could escape to America and elsewhere. Aristides de Sousa Mendes, a Portuguese diplomat who was in Paris, sacrificed his own career and well-being to save Jews. Because of his efforts in opening up a refugee escape route, de Sousa Mendes has been honored as one of the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. Today, Aristides de Sousa Mendes is also recognized as one of Portugal's chief national heroes, for which we are very grateful. We will now receive remarks from His Excellency Domingos Fezas Vital, Ambassador of Portugal to the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I want to start by thanking you for your kind invitation. It is an honor for me to address you on this occasion, especially as Portugal is holding this semester the presidency of the Council of the European Union. Human rights in general have always been at the core of the EU's foreign policy, and among these the fight against anti-Semitism will always be paramount. We are 70 years away from the most egregious horrors committed during the Second World War, and indeed the years preceding it, against the Jewish people and also other minorities. If anything, it has become more necessary than ever to remember the Holocaust and to honor those who survived and those who died. Why? Because memories are fading, and with it comes the risk of some sort of relativism that unfortunately has been surfacing here and there in Europe. Because less and less of those who lived firsthand the unimaginable atrocities of the ghettos and the gas chambers are still among us. Because the youth has to be taught to ensure that nothing like it can occur ever again. The Holocaust has been the greatest atrocity in history. That is why Portugal stands proudly among other nations who join the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. We honor the memory of Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the first diplomat to be recognized as righteous among the nations by the State of Israel, and others less well-known figures, such as the Catholic priest Joaquim Carreira or the private citizen José Brito Mendes. They all helped Jews escape the Nazi clutches during the Second World War. It is only fair to acknowledge our own past. It makes no sense to point at the splinter in the eyes of others if we don't remove the log in our own eyes. In the 16th century, the Portuguese king, egged on by bigotry and misguided notions of unity, expelled Jewish communities that were living since time immemorial, back from the days of the Roman Empire, in the territory that became Portugal. This was a tragedy, first and foremost for those who were expelled, or worse, killed, of course. But it was also a long-term tragedy for the kingdom itself, as it lost valuable subjects that emigrated to other countries. Indeed, at the time of the global discoveries, they reinforced our competitors, who greatly benefited from the brain drain that unwittingly we ourselves had produced. I would exhaust my time if I were to list all the famous individuals of Portuguese Sephardic origin that went on to make a name for themselves. Today, I would like to remember the philosopher Spinoza, because, as the Bible, a precious gift to the world of Jewish culture says, "Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you." That is why, as you all know very well, my country has in place a nationality acquisition scheme for descendants of Sephardic Jews, whose ancestry can be traced back to Portugal. We encourage those entitled and willing to apply to liaise with the Jewish communities in Lisbon and Oporto, who will guide you in the process. Allow me a brief final word concerning the present. Portugal has undergone tremendous changes in past decades. It has now an educated English-speaking workforce, enjoys first-class healthcare, promotes innovation and connectiveness in the digital world, especially among the young. This all happens while we can, please excuse my immodesty, boast about our warm hospitality, our superb climate, and our natural, warm and tasty food, which, as every January month in Washington reminds us, is also nice. That is why, if you haven't done so, I want to invite you all to visit Portugal when conditions so permit. To enjoy as a tourist, to appreciate our heritage, including restored Jewish sites, such as the ones we can find in Belmonte, Castelo de Vide, or Monsanto, but also to study or to start a business. The place that is, for some of you, the home of your forefathers, is ready to welcome you all with our arms wide open. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Ambassador Domingos Fesas Vital for his remarks, and congratulations to Portugal for embarking on the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. As the Jewish world yearns for a better and lasting peace in the Middle East, the recent actions by Morocco are an immense and very valued contribution to building peace for everyone, a step that has special significance when we reflect on the consequences of intolerance. We forever remain grateful to Morocco's King Mohammed V, whose righteous actions stopped the Nazis short of eradicating the kingdom's large Sephardic Jewish community, even allowing others to find refuge there, including a young boy from France named Isaac El-Grabli of blessed memory. We are also thankful to His Majesty King Mohammed VI for leading by example and upholding the proud heritage of tolerance perpetuated by his forefathers. We will now receive remarks from Her Highness Lala Jumala Alawi, Ambassador of Morocco to the United States.
Honorable Congressman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Representative Raskin and Mr. Katzer, Director of Sephardic Heritage International, DC, for their leadership in organizing this third edition of the Congressional Holocaust Commemoration. I am truly humbled to be part of this event as we pause to remember the victims of the Holocaust. We are also here to honor the fortunate ones who managed to pull through this tragic ordeal and to hear their voices. Their stories never cease to inspire courage, awe, and admiration. As our humanity went through one of its darkest hours, glimmers of light emerged around the Mediterranean, in North Africa and beyond, as some brave individuals stood up in defiance of evil by seeking to protect the persecuted or provide refuge to those forced to flee. As you may know, my country, Morocco, has a unique history with the Jewish people. Successive waves of Jewish refugees found shelter in Morocco as far back as 2 millennia, following the destruction of the Temple of Solomon, the fall of Andalusia in 1492, or during World War II. They formed a vibrant Jewish community that became an integral part of the kingdom's society and culture, as highlighted in our Constitution, which enshrines the importance of the Hebraic influence to Morocco's identity. During World War II, when Morocco was under French protectorate, my late grandfather, His Majesty King Mohammed V, stood up to protect 250,000 Moroccan Jews by refusing to comply with the race laws of the pro-Nazi Vichy government. He famously replied, "There are no Jews in Morocco, there are only Moroccan subjects." The lives and properties of Moroccan Jews were thus kept under his protection, and this bold action prompted many to seek safe haven in Morocco during the remainder of the war. Ladies and gentlemen, stories of victims and survivors must be amplified and carried forward so that future generations never forget this horrific chapter of our history. Only through education can we prevent the errors of the past from recurring. It is in this spirit that Morocco recently became the first country in the Arab world to add Jewish history to its national school curriculum, alongside many other efforts spearheaded by His Majesty the King to promote, protect, and rehabilitate Jewish heritage. Such efforts include the maintenance of Jewish cemeteries and rebuilding historic Jewish neighborhoods. Furthermore, His Majesty King Mohammed VI has forcefully rejected Holocaust when he declared, and I quote, that anti-Semitism is the antithesis of freedom of expression. It implies a denial of the other and is an admission of failure, inadequacy, and an inability to coexist. The fact that we still need to fight against Holocaust denial is a sobering reminder that much more needs to be done and that we should never be complacent, particularly in reaction to rising extremism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. Intolerance against people based on ethnic origin or religion should have no place in our world today, or even, again, as we seek to make this reality, we all are required to never forget and to work collectively to ensure that no one else does. You can always count on Morocco to do its part in building a future of peaceful coexistence. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Her Highness Ambassador Lala Jumal Al-Alawi. We are most grateful to Morocco for its firm commitment to Holocaust education and to combating anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. We will now have the musical commemoration component of our program performed by world-renowned pianist Reynan Cohen, a member of the Jewish community in Turkey. I should note that Turkish diplomats such as Selahattin Ülkümen, who was recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, rescued a number of Jews during the war, including French and Rhodesli Jews who were Turkish citizens. Reynan is going to play Árboles lloran por lluvia, which in Ladino or Judeo-Spanish means trees cry for rain. And while she plays, let's take a moment to reflect on all those who perished during the Holocaust as well as the survivors who are no longer with us. I now give the floor to Renan Cohen, who is joining us from Istanbul.
So I would like to play, as Ephraim perfectly said, Arboles por Lluvia, because I choose this song because this song sang by Jews from Thessaloniki in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So it says, trees cry for the rain, and I cry for your eyes, my love. So I would like to play for all the victims who perished and who suffered in Holocaust. And I wish never again, no more discrimination, no more hate, no more xenophobia for everybody in the world.
Thank you so much, Renan.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. It's very meaningful for me to be here tonight.
Thank you for that moving musical commemoration for all those who perished in the Holocaust and for all the survivors who are no longer with us. We also note that Sephardic survivor Flori Jagoda sang Alvarez Joran Porluvia, when a new memorial tablet in Ladino was unveiled at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 2003.
I'm Alan Makovsky, a member of the board of SHIN-DC, and it's my great privilege to introduce the State Department's Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, Ms. Cherry Daniels. Special Envoy Daniels is a career diplomat who has had a number of interesting and important assignments over the years, including in Jerusalem, before she began her current critical work. She speaks several languages, including Hebrew. Madam Special Envoy, it's an honor to have you with us here on this occasion. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan Makovsky, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the hosts and co-hosts, Chairman Meeks, Representative Raskin, SHIN-DC, and the distinguished excellencies and guests who you have on today's program. I'm so honored to be included in such a group. I wish we could share this kind of commemoration in person. I think that would be so meaningful to me rather than doing it virtually, but I'm so grateful that you did allow it to go forward as a virtual one this year, and perhaps the time to come together will come next year. I particularly welcome the commemoration's focus on refugees and the plight of European Jewish refugees, whether in North Africa or in Europe and across the Balkans and Iberian Peninsula during World War II. It's a chapter of the Holocaust that is not often enough highlighted specifically in the annual Holocaust commemorations. As the Department of State Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, I'm committed to promoting historically accurate Holocaust commemoration and education and research and archive opening around the world. And I think today's event greatly advances those goals. At a time where many have commented that we're facing growing Holocaust distortion and denial, but mainly distortion and conspiracy theories about the Holocaust, the mission that you have is more important than ever, promoting historically accurate commemoration and memory and telling the stories, as Dr. Bourla did, of putting those stories forward firsthand so that we can learn what happened. About 450,000 to 500,000 Jews called Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya home at the beginning of World War II. And they were joined years before that by after the war, they were joined by thousands of European Jews who fled there in the face of Nazi persecution in Europe. The Jews in the region that we're discussing today ended up sharing a common history of suffering and persecution at the hands of Nazi authorities or the French Vichy government or the Italian fascist collaborators and others who governed in those countries during part of the war. And their experience, their suffering from North Africa and from the Balkan and Iberian Peninsula need to be understood, remembered, honored, shared, as you're doing. The history that we're looking at is a complex one, and I believe it's incredibly useful to have heard from the ambassadors who have already spoken as to what happened in their countries and the history, the complex history. It's also a history sprinkled with unheralded acts of heroism, resilience, and kindness by Jews and non-Jews alike. We all may be familiar with the heroic actions taken by the Portuguese Consul General in Bordeaux, de Sousa Mendes, who the Portuguese ambassador very greatly just mentioned, who defied the instructions of his superiors and provided transit visas into Portugal for tens of thousands of Jews who were fleeing Nazi persecution. However, I doubt enough Americans know about the transit camp near Casablanca that hosted Jewish refugees on their way to the Americas. And I was pleased that I was able to visit Morocco in an earlier assignment. I also doubt that many know of the actions taken by Sephardic Jewish community members in Tangiers to welcome and assimilate the mass of Eastern European Jewish refugees who sought refuge on its shores. There are many other such stories that I think it's important to carry forward for those who do not know enough about the history of what happened during World War II in this region. It's pertinent for our own times. The focus of today's event on refugees is pertinent for all of us today, because Jewish refugees in World War II have much in common with refugees today, fleeing every kind of war and persecution, whether in Syria, whether it's the Rohingya fleeing oppression and violence in Burma, whether it's Uyghurs seeking to avoid internment in Chinese camps in Xinjiang. The fact of the matter is that too many in the international community, including to some extent in our own country, as Chairman Meeks mentioned, largely failed the Jewish people in its time of need during the Holocaust. He mentioned, for example, the St. Louis ship that was turned back, and there are many other such examples. We need to ask ourselves whether the same international community is failing to learn and apply the lessons of the Holocaust, and whether we're doing enough to educate our own citizens here in this country about the dangers of where unchecked anti-Semitism and other forms of racial hatred can lead. I was pleased in that respect that the Congress in May or June of last year passed the Never Again Education Act, providing funding through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for $2 million a year over the next 5 years to increase education in our own country. I believe the history of European Jewish refugees in North Africa and the Middle East during World War II can play a role in tearing down the walls of denial about the Holocaust, of distortion that persists today in some parts of the Muslim world and in some segments of Muslim communities here in the West. Everyone should know about the acts of heroism and the righteous among the nations that were mentioned today, and everyone should know of the other experiences when that was not the case and people did turn in the Jewish communities to the Nazis. In other cases, it needs to be specific. One cannot generalize. One must be specific to each of the communities. And that sort of acknowledging of the past forthrightly with open eyes and not turning away from that past is the only way to learn and bring forward for the future generations the lessons that were brought forward out of the Holocaust. I'd like to conclude by thanking you again for the opportunity to be part of the program and perhaps quoting maybe what was not yet fully distributed in case people had missed President Biden's statement on the Holocaust Remembrance Day yesterday, when he said, the Holocaust was no accident of history. It occurred because too many governments cold-bloodedly adopted and implemented hate-fueled laws, policies, and practices to vilify and dehumanize entire groups of people. And too many individuals, he said, stood by silently. Silence is complicity, the president said. And he went on to say, as my late friend and Holocaust survivor, Tom Lantos, so frequently reminded us, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest. With that, I'd like to turn the program back over, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much, Special Envoy Sherry Daniels, for your remarks. I now turn the program over to Dr. Devin Nahr, the Isaac Al-Hadef Professor in Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington, who will present on various historical factors related to the plight of Jews of diverse backgrounds seeking refuge during the war. This will include the story of a Sephardic teenager from Rhodes, Claire Barkey Flash, who journeyed through 3 continents to escape the Holocaust, finding refuge in Tangier, Morocco, until she could immigrate to the United States. This presentation is dedicated to Claire Barkey Flash of blessed memory. Professor Nahr, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. It's a great honor for me to be here today with you all, and a great privilege to share some of the historical context as we think about the theme for today's program, the fate of Jewish refugees in the Holocaust, and in particular, Sephardic Jews. And it's an honor to be here with SHIN-DC and all of the dignitaries and Dr. Albert Burla as well. As Representative Meeks mentioned, when we think about, and others as well alluded to it, that when we think about refugees and the Holocaust, we often think about the SS St. Louis. But those same policies of exclusion enacted by the United States government also had a devastating impact on hopeful Jewish refugees across a wide geography, including Sephardic Jews, whose stories are generally not part of our collective narratives of the Holocaust. While we may not associate territories of the former Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe and along the Mediterranean with the Holocaust, the major Sephardic Jewish communities there were also devastated during the war. The island of Rhodes, for example, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's not really doesn't even make the cut on this map. And the tragedy was particularly acute right here in Salonika, as we already heard from Dr. Bourla, the city where he is from and his family. It is also the city where my own grandfather was born. Thessaloniki was a distinctive Jewish center, not only because the bulk of its members trace their origins to the Spanish expulsion of 1492, but also because for nearly 5 centuries, they continued to speak their Spanish-based language, which also incorporated elements and influences from Hebrew and Turkish and Greek and Italian, written in Hebrew letters, until the 20th century, but they also constituted the plurality and in some moments the majority of the city's multi-ethnic and multi-religious and multilinguistic population, comprised also of Greeks and Turks, Bulgarians, some Armenians, Roma. So profound was the Jewish imprint on the urban fabric of the city that the port even closed in observance of the Jewish Sabbath. The city gained the nickname as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. But the violence of the Balkan Wars and World War I, rising nationalism, anti-Semitism, economic troubles provoked Jews to leave, as from so many other locales during that era. When it came to the United States, many confronted obstacles in their efforts to gain entrance into this country, as widespread race science and eugenics thinking of the era shaped American immigration policies. The Dillingham Commission, for example, which was under the aegis of the US Congress during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, literally ranked the world's races from most desirable to least desirable, with Western European nations, races at the top, and Africans and indigenous people at the bottom. This hierarchy will probably be, unfortunately, familiar to us still today. Jews were designated as a distinct racial group toward the bottom of the hierarchy. Hebrew, along with Syrians, as Semites. Jews also, therefore, became the target of immigration restriction laws implemented by the US Congress in the wake of World War I, most infamously by Washington State Congressman Albert Johnson, who, in pushing forward the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, had infamously called Jews filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits. They, along with other immigrants from the Middle East, from Southern Europe, and from Eastern Europe, constituted what were referred to as the stream of alien blood that was threatening to pollute white America, and it had to be stopped. The 1924 immigration laws therefore drastically cut down the number of immigrants coming to this country in general, and in particular, the rate of Jewish migration dropped precipitously. People across the world noticed. In a prison cell not far from Munich, Adolf Hitler, in fact, found inspiration in this new legislation implemented in the United States. In Mein Kampf, he actually praised the United States not only for its treatment of Native Americans, for its continued segregation of blacks and whites and the prohibition of interracial marriage, the subjugation of America's colonial subjects in places like Puerto Rico, but he also celebrated the new immigration restriction laws that would keep Jews out. This, he saw, would be a way for the United States to remain racially pure, and so that whites would persist in their role as masters of the American continent. In this framework, the story of my own family comes into play. For these policies took a toll on Jews all across the world, including as far afield as places like Thessaloniki and Rhodes. In order to enter the United States in the wake of the new immigration laws in 1924, many hopeful Jews, my relatives included, had no choice but to fudge some documents or resort to other illicit means to bypass immigration restrictions to enter this country. This is my grandfather right here, this little boy. And it is only for this reason, their skirting of the immigration laws, that I am here today. My grandfather's oldest brother, Tio Salomon, and his wife Esther, and their two children, Benjamin and Rachel, were less fortunate. Solomon had actually lived in the United States for several years, but returned to Greece at the end of World War I. When he tried to secure a visa to come back, he faced the new immigration restrictions, and he insisted on trying to follow the rules and applied for visas for his family every year for more than a decade. With very few slots available for people from all across the country of Greece, they never succeeded. In a desperate letter they wrote, in Ladino, in Judeo-Spanish, in the traditional Sephardic Hebrew script known as Solitreo. And here's the beginning of the letter. Por mis queridos parientes, caro papá, for my dear parents, my relatives, beloved father, veramente ya nos metió a todas las ideas y non se sabe cuál hacer, siendo le hago saber que en vuestra mano non hay nada, siempre es en vosotros. Truly, we have already expended all ideas, and we do not know what to do. So I therefore tell you that it is out of our hands, and our fate is now in yours. The occupation of Greece in 1941 resulted in the division of the country into various zones of occupation, as you can see here. Tio Salomon and his family wound up in Thessaloniki in the German zone of occupation, and they wound up among the last Jews in the city. Salomon, who was fluent in Greek, was placed in charge of distributing milk and yogurt to the sick and the elderly as they boarded the cattle cars on the way to Auschwitz. Salomon and his family, however, soon joined the rest of the Jews of Salonika, deported to Auschwitz in June of 1943, where they were murdered. Of the nearly 50,000 Jews of Salonika deported to Auschwitz, perhaps fewer than 2,000 survived, and very little of the Jewish presence in the city remained, destroyed not only by the Nazis, but also by local Greek Christian collaborators who leveled dozens of synagogues, and even at the initiative of the municipality, leveled and destroyed the vast Jewish cemetery of Salonika to make way for the university. And here you can see the original building of the university, and here you can see its destruction, which began at the end of 1942. 300,000 graves decimated, the largest Jewish burial ground in Europe, stretching over the space of 80 football fields, a space where today stands the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Life on Rhodes also was devastatingly impacted by the Second World War, and other Jews pursued other paths in their search for escape and survival. On this small Aegean island, today part of Greece, but for centuries also part of the Ottoman Empire, and after 1912, part of the Italian Empire, Rhodes was home to a small but important Sephardic Jewish community of a few thousand. Like Salonika, Rhodes experienced major political, economic, and cultural transformations during the first decades of the 20th century. By the 1920s, Mussolini's government was even funding an important rabbinical seminary on the island. But the changing dynamics also led many Rhodeslees to seek their fortunes elsewhere, migrating to Europe or as far away as the Belgian Congo, others coming to the United States, including the furthest reaches of the Pacific Northwest, to Seattle, the city where I currently reside. During the Depression in 1930, a young 9-year-old Sephardic Jewish girl on the island of Rhodes, Clara Barki, began to correspond in Ladino with her aunt and uncle, Rafael and Rachel Capeludo, who had settled in Seattle years before. And thanks to Clara's correspondence, she was able to rely on her relatives in the United States to help her chart her family's escape from the island. In a letter written in 1938, similar in tone to the letter that I shared from my own family, she writes, "Heaven will decide our fate and will determine where we wind up. Except, dear uncle, if you take pity on us and show us a way of escape. I throw myself at your feet, dear uncle, and beg you to do your utmost to save us. Imagine that what may happen to us already happened once in Spain. In our despair, the only help we can expect is from you. We rack our brains to find ways to escape. We see no one but you. I repeat, we have no one." And then in a final plea in 1939, Clara writes prophetically, "I beg you to come to our aid to save us from the fire that awaits us." The problem, of course, was there were so few places that Jewish refugees at the time could seek refuge. The quota system in the United States did not enable the family to acquire the necessary visas at the time, in part also because the father of Orhan Barki had been born in mainland Turkey and was a Turkish citizen that made him even less welcomed in the context of the United States and America's racial hierarchy. And it was because he was born elsewhere, not on the island of Rhodes, that the family faced the prospect of immediate expulsion. Who would accept Jews in such circumstances? At the last moment, Clara received word that Tangier, which was already alluded to before, an international city in Morocco, would accept the family as refugees. And it is there, in a refugee camp, where the family survived the war years, 1939 to 1946, in challenging circumstances, but circumstances that nonetheless permitted them to evade the devastating fate that would wipe out all of the remaining Jews on Rhodes. I want you to imagine the ferocity with which the Nazis sought to execute the final solution. It's the summer of 1944. The war is nearing its end, and in this context, Nazis decided to dedicate their resources to rounding up fewer than 2,000 Jews on a remote island in the Aegean, from which you can literally see Turkey. They were deported by ship to Athens, and then from there, following the same path that the Jews of Thessaloniki had previously traversed, on the railroad tracks, they found their fate in Auschwitz. They suffered the longest journey of essentially all the victims of the Holocaust. 23 days it took them to arrive at Auschwitz, where then they were murdered. Fewer than 150 survived. If we do not understand the efforts that the Nazis put into destroying such tiny communities in even remote places, we cannot see the power and the determination, the centrality of implementing the final solution for Nazi Germany. The fate of Clara Barki and her family, however, was not yet secure. Even after the war, the family could not get visas to come to the United States. The Seattle relatives gathered funds and they wrote letters to vouch for the Barki family, promising that they would not become public charges, a term that we've heard about again recently. The Seattle family even secured the backing of a Washington state member of Congress, Hugh DeLacy, and they traveled across the country via train to Washington, D.C. to testify on behalf of the relatives who remained in Tangier. And it was only with such great effort, with such resources and determination, that the U.S. government finally granted the family the much coveted visas. And they were able to settle in Seattle with their relatives in 1946. The father, however, the former Turkish citizen, was separated from his family for 3 years. As a Turkish citizen, was not permitted to enter the country until 1949. In this post-war moment, a moment of reckoning, in the wake of the devastation unleashed by Nazi Germany, the logic of race science, the categories in which we were organizing our society were not completely upended, but rather they were reshuffled. The United States did not do away with its long history of racial hierarchies, encoding them in law, but rather what they did was expanded the boundaries of whiteness, now classifying European Jews no longer as Hebrew by race, a separate race, but rather European Jews could now enter the mainstream as whites. And you can literally see this transformation take place in the Barki family documents. You see here, Hebrew is crossed out and on top is written white. Their racial identity in the country, the racial placement of Jews in the American framework is transformed with the stroke of a pen. Only in 1952 did the United States abolish racial prerequisites for immigrants to become naturalized citizens of the United States. And only in 1965 were the quotas implemented in 1924 overturned. Unfortunately, the experiences of my great uncle, locked out from the American visas, that of Albert Burla's family, who also remained in Europe, in Greece. These stories were much more common than the exceptional and remarkable case of Clara Barchi and her family, whose resilience against all odds must be acknowledged. While many of the devastating policies that kept so many Jewish refugees out of the United States have dissipated in recent years, the legacies of those laws, the underlying racist ideas that shaped them, continue to inform how our society thinks about immigrants and refugees today. And that is our challenge of remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nar, for an informative presentation and for honoring the blessed memory of Claire Barchi Flash and also others who shared a similar experience seeking refuge during the Holocaust. I now turn the program over to Professor Alma Rachel Heckman, the Newfield Levin Chair in Holocaust Studies at UC Santa Cruz, who will address the need to expand the scope of Holocaust narratives by talking about the experiences of Jewish refugees in North Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of Asia. Dr. Heckman, the floor is yours.
Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for this invitation to address this group. Today, I've been asked to speak about European Jewish refugees in North Africa. Thousands of European Jewish refugees found safe harbor in the Middle East and North Africa during the Second World War, fleeing Nazi and local government persecutions. These locations included the breadth of North Africa, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, among others. This point often goes underappreciated, particularly given the upheavals in the region in the 1950s and 1960s with regard to regional wars with Israel and the mass migration of Jews from their homelands. Maintaining historical memory is critical for understanding the long view of mutual aid instead of the short view that privileges an emphasis on strife. In my remaining time, I will focus on North Africa, namely French North Africa, that is to say Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. By the first decade of the 20th century, all three of these countries came under French colonial rule. Algeria beginning in 1830, Tunisia as a protectorate in 1881, and Morocco as a protectorate in 1912. After the rise of Nazi rule in 1933, German Jewish refugees began to flee in response to escalating anti-Semitic legislation and violence, which extended widely across Europe during the Second World War. Thousands of European Jewish refugees fled to North Africa, seeking visas to hopefully get to the Americas. When, however, France fell to Nazi Germany early in the summer of 1940, these refugees were largely trapped. Some of them were absorbed by local Jewish communities who themselves suffered from persecutory anti-Semitic Vichy legislation, with educational organizations like the Alliance Israélite Universelle managing their temporary settlement along with local Jewish communal institutions. Famously, Sophie Freud, the granddaughter of Sigmund Freud, found temporary shelter in Casablanca while awaiting a ship to the Americas. Others were placed in a variety of camps, including temporary placement camps where they scraped by. The least fortunate, those deemed politically undesirable, namely leftists and anti-fascist activists that included many who had fought for France in the First World War or in the 1939 campaign against Nazi Germany, were placed in labor camps and punishment camps. The camps were built to fulfill the long-standing French colonial dream of a trans-Saharan railway that would connect the Algerian Mediterranean port city of Oran to Senegal in French West Africa. The goal of the railroad was to more efficiently ship mining goods from French colonial lands from Oran to the French port city of Marseille. Accordingly, prisoners in the camps worked on constructing the railroad itself or in the mines in backbreaking labor conditions, regardless of the weather. With the Allied Operation Torch in November of 1942, the American Army began the slow process of liberating the camps, relying heavily on the help of American Jewish aid organizations, such as the American Joint Distribution Committee, known as the JDC or the Joint, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or HIAS, and the Quaker American Friends Service Committee, all of which coordinated with the Red Cross. At the same time, Nazis responded to Operation Torch by directly occupying Tunisia for a period of 6 brutal months, intensifying an already dire set of conditions for Jews in Tunisia, both indigenous and European, where in contrast to Morocco and Algeria, local indigenous Tunisian Jews were placed in forced labor camps under direct Nazi supervision. Eventually, they too were liberated in 1943. The JDC, HIAS, the American Friends Service Committee worked together with the American Army and other local Jewish community organizations to help refugees secure and eventually visas and safe passage out of North Africa, many of whom headed to the Americas at last. So to conclude, what lessons might we draw from this brief sketch of an intensely complicated and fraught time period? North Africa was at once a place of anti-Semitic persecution under the collaborationist Vichy regime, and also a place of refuge. It embodies the contradictions of lived history and represents a sobering reminder. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heckman. And that concludes our program for today. As we observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it is so important to remember that countries and Jewish communities around the world were affected by the Holocaust. And it is so important to remember and transmit all of our stories and memories, including the memories that people have from their families of those experiences. Thanks again to Dr. Albert Burla and to all of our distinguished and excellent speakers for their significant words of remembrance. Thanks again to the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C., and also to all of our co-sponsors. Each program that Sephardic Heritage International, or SHIN, does is something to build on, and we hope to see all of you again for other upcoming events. We also look forward to having our next Congressional Holocaust Commemoration, please God, in person for 2022. Stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everyone.